This week, we're joined by Mon Reyes of Not So Secular Podcast to have a debrief of my recent SOGIE Bill Dialogue in PI Podcast. Lahat ng yan, dito lang sa The JAY ARUGA Show. Welcome to the JAY ARUGA Show, the first conservative podcast in the Philippines where we help you defend life, marriage, and the family in this crazy world that we're living in. We have a guest today because this will be a special episode. To those who don't know, I was invited to have a dialogue with a pro-SOGIE bill advocate. His name is Michael Pastor and it's in PI Podcast. I believe the dialogue was received well. My good friend, who I will introduce in a bit, listened to the dialogue and pitched me this idea. Why not make a debrief episode, just like how Trent Horn does after his debates? So it's a good idea, actually. So here we are. I'm joined by that friend, host of Not So Secular Podcast. I don't need to give him a lengthy introduction because listeners of the JAY ARUGA Show already know him. He's none other than Mon Reyes. Mon, kamusta?
Hello, good evening. It's good to get to join you again, Jay. Good evening to the listeners also. Hello pala kasi hindi ko alam kung gabi sila makikinig.
Okay lang. How's everything since we last talked? Alam ko ang daming ganap sa buhay mo.
Yeah. Well, I recently I was tapped to be part of a new ministry. I was always with the FEAST, ganyan, and I've been with the youth ministry for so long as a missionary, before as a volunteer lang, later on as a missionary. Until now, I'm still a youth missionary, but earlier this year, I was tapped to be a preacher also for FEAST Bellevue PM sa Alabang. So, yun, available naman yun sa mga live stream online, but if you want to visit also, that's every Sunday sa Bellevue Hotel sa Alabang.
Ang gandang hotel nun. Sa Alabang, malapit sa Festival Mall. Tama ba?
Yes. So that's one of the things, big things na I've been up to recently. Yun. Aside from the other stuff na napag-usapan na rin natin dati, like yung homeschooling.
Yung progressive homeschool.
Progressive. In terms of the method, not the values.
Okay. Anyway, alam mo ba na kasama ka na sa elite list of the JAY ARUGA Show guest who appeared here at the podcast the most. So kasama mo na sina Burns, Okaasi, Brother J. Paul Hernandez, and third time na kayong nag-appear dito sa podcast. And ayun, wala namang anything to brag about that.
It's an honor.
Pero mahigitan mo sila one day kasi I still owe you our episode, yung kung saan i-interviewin kita ng solo about what you really do and the book that you have written with Bene Sanchez. So, abangan.
Yeah, sure. Sounds great.
Kahapon magkasama tayo and by the way, you mentioned, ngayon ko lang nalaman that you get into heated back and forth when you talk about the church moral teachings. Di ba? And kaya nga magre-rebrand ka na, mag-use ka na din ng pseudonym.
Well, hindi ko naman
joke lang yun actually.
Arguments basically. It's more of like I kasi nga like when on a preaching platform, diba? Like we teach and we share and so on and so forth and do things on social media and on the podcast also. Sometimes every now and then some people respond. It's natural. I'm sure like you've encountered this more.
I just want to say that I honor you for doing that because a lot of people would play it safe, diba? Pero the church's teaching it's the truth. And we just want to warn people that it could lead to disaster kung hindi na susundin yung what Christ teaches, di ba?
Yeah, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, I've seen din na usually ano talaga eh, no? Like depende talaga sa context eh, right? The reason why I mention some of
Mm-mm.
these things on the public platforms is because ayoko naman na parang ang default na stance, moral stance is
Mm-mm.
just the other side, just because that's the only side that people hear. On the other hand, we also understand na like different people go through different things, and when
Mm-mm.
we're talking about these truths, diba, it's also good to approach it in a within the context of a friendship, within the
Mm-mm.
context of a trusted relationship,
Oh yeah.
ganyan, and
Yeah.
combine gentleness with truth and mga ganyang bagay.
It's hard. Kaya nga tinatawag na, na hard conversations to. Uh, all right. We're doing this debrief because you listened to my dialogue on the SOGIE Bill and you pitched me
Yes.
this wonderful idea of a debrief. So tulad to nung ginagawa ni na Trent Horn after he debates someone. And thanks for that, Mon, for pitching me this idea.
Yeah, yeah. Kasi ako personally, I was really excited when I saw the episode with PI Podcast. Ako
Mm-mm.
personally, I also listened to their podcast. Actually, I very much enjoy their
Mm-mm.
podcast. Isa sila sa mga gusto ko na Filipino content creators. Okay din kasi like unlike us, 'di ba? They're not really religious,
Oh yeah.
political lang topic ng kanilang podcast. So I think it's really good. I like them. Pareha sila, si
Mm-mm.
Matt at si Borge. And so when I
Mm-mm.
got to listen to your episode, I figured, pwede natin gawin yun. Yung ginagawa nila Jimmy Akin, yung ginagawa nila Trent Horn.
Mm-mm.
Possibly, para siyang review, while at the same time, it's an opportunity to talk and reflect more for you to get to talk and reflect more on the discussion
Yeah.
now that
Thanks.
it's done, it's over with. Because sometimes in the heat of the moment, pag nagda-dialogue or nagde-debate or anything like that, sometimes hindi naman natin nasasabi lahat ng gusto natin sabihin, di ba?
Yes,
Ganyan.
yes. So
Yun.
thanks. And sakto ikaw yung kasama ko when we interviewed Jason Everett. So it's only
Yeah.
fitting that we get to talk about the SOGIE dialogue because we'd like to catch up after that conversation with Jason. Kasi yun din halos yung
Yes.
topic di ba? Okay, Mon, I'll leave it to you. Go ahead.
Right. Yeah. So I'll just be asking some questions, 'di ba? I have siguro as a disclaimer for people, no. I have my own stances also, ganyan, but I will do my best to be fair since I'm talking to you at wala dito ang iyong dialogue partner, si Michael.
Yeah.
I'm taking the role of an interviewer, which by the way, si Matt of PI Podcast did really well.
Kudos, Matt. Yeah.
So let's begin with some of your thoughts on what happened, diba? How did this dialogue come about? And how did it turn out? So paano siya na-bring up? Paano ka nila kinontact and so on? What made you say yes? And based on how it went, anong sa tingin mo? Could you give us a brief summary of the entire thing from your perspective?
Okay. Listeners of this show are aware that early this season, we had Jason Everett and medyo naging heavy tayo on discussing gender ideology. And because na rin dun sa nakita ko yung notebook ng anak ko na grade 10 and nakita ko ng lessons on gender ideology. So she's studying in a Catholic school. I brought this up sa school, sa principal. I sent an email to the principal. And you'll know the story if you listen to the earlier episodes of this season. To cut the long story short, I posted a lot of things against SOGIE Bill, gender ideology. And it caught Matt's attention ng PI Podcast. And he messaged me. Nag-guest na rin ako before sa PI Podcast eh. Pero ito, somehow, Mon, itong message ni Matt, bago ko pa basahin, I feel na alam ko na yung laman. Parang feel ko na i-invite niya ako sa PI Podcast to discuss the SOGIE Bill with someone. So, may parang may foresight na ako na yun yung magiging message niya. And I got excited actually. Hindi ko alam kung ito yung first time that I debated someone or dialogued with someone on a podcast. I think I did one or two before. Pero on the topic of the SOGIE bill, na-excite ako because that's what we're preaching, di ba? Yung huling episode ko before I took a break is the 3 pillars sa mission. And one of them is yung preparing. I learned yung 3 secrets to sharing the faith ni Trent Horn. And I'd like to apply them to dialogue with someone on things that we don't agree with. So, nag-oo ako kagad actually. And in fact, si Matt nga, he asked me if I know someone na pwedeng anti-SOGIE. Ako na yung nag-raise ng hand. So,
Okay. So, ikaw ang may kilala kay Michael. Tama ba?
No. Hindi ko kilala si
Okay,
Michael.
okay.
Si Matt Ordonez, the host, he asked me if I know someone
To
who
represent your
to
side.
represent my side.
Okay.
Hindi naman niya,
gets.
hindi naman niya, actually, he asked me kung pwede ako, if not, if I know someone. Pero, good thing pwede naman ako. I was actually excited. So, hindi ko alam kung sino yung makaka-dialogue ko. I tried not to ask. We were given 3 rules dun sa dialogue. I intentionally didn't ask kung sino yung other person because yung 3 rules, if I remember it correctly, number 1, we should keep it secular, yung usapan. No religious stuff. Which is no problem because parang when we talk about it naman dito sa the JAY ARUGA Show, lahat ng mga moral issues, I'm used to talking about them in a secular manner. So, okay lang yung number 2 is no ad hominem. So, bawal siraan.
Very important.
Very important. Which is fine dahil we preach this din naman. So, we need to walk the talk. Kaya, excited ako dito sa dialogue. And that's the reason kung bakit hindi ko tinanong kung sino yung makaka-dialogue ko. Para talagang totally iwas ad hominem. Not that talagang sisiraan ko siya, but may additional layer lang para hindi ko talaga siya ma-address on an ad hominem attack. And number 3, if I remember it correctly, is bawal kaming mag-butt in habang nagsasalita yung isa. So, which is fine, di ba? Parang, but, humingi ako ng request kay Matt. Sabi ko, Matt, maybe pwede akong I'd like to request kung pwede akong magtanong dun sa pro-SOGIE advocate. Because the reason I asked that is I saw this problem in some so-called dialogues on the SOGIE bill where yung dalawang advocates, pro and anti, they talk past each other. Yung host, they ask questions, tapos parang sasagot lang yung isa, sasagot yung kabila, tapos i-re-rebut na lang nila yung sagot ng isa dun sa next question na. Hindi sila nag-uusap yung dalawang advocates. So parang dating nagpaparinigan lang yung dalawang advocates. Kaya I specifically asked Matt kung pwedeng tanungin ko yung other side. And that's what we encourage people din naman when we're in a dialogue, yung Socratic method, di ba? So there, si Trent, I know he prepares for a debate, personalized yung approach niya, whether be abortion, atheism, or something else. If you remember, parang may debate siya with Destiny recently.
Oh, yes.
Diba? Sobrang nag-prepare siya doon by watching Destiny's previous debates on abortion. And that's how he prepared. Kaya, point by point, meron siyang isasagot at meron din siyang itatanong. Yung brief summary, that's the brief summary of how this came to be. For me, I prepared for this by watching I watched previous SOGIE dialogues and debates. So that's how I prepared.
Yeah. Okay yun, no? I think okay that you're sharing now the 3 rules that they established, as well as what you said na you asked permission if you could ask questions. Kasi the this dialogue, 'di ba? It's not a structured debate eh. Hindi siya yung may
Oo.
opening, tapos may cross-examination, tapos may
Oo.
timer. Hindi siya ganun
Oo.
eh. It's more of a
Hindi.
moderated dialogue. So there's the two of you and
Mm.
there's Matt who's moderating the entire conversation. Ganyan. So I think well, overall I think it went well,
Thank
ganon.
you.
So let's get into that mismo, dun the content of what you talked about. I think it's good to begin kumbaga, with common ground. Ano ba
Yes, of
yung, so
course.
basing from your conversation, ano yung genuine points of agreement kayong dalawa ni Michael? Before we talk about where you disagree, that's the point of the dialogue, what were your
Mm.
genuine points of agreement? Yung talagang, okay, on the same page kayo dito.
I think our point of points of agreement are, of course, we really need to care for people who I think during the whole dialogue I refrained from calling persons lesbian, gay, transgender. So ito yung sinasabi ni na Jason Everett, we refer to them as persons who identify as this, as gay, para hindi nawawala yung word na person. I think the genuine point of agreement is we need to really care for the needs ng persons who identify as lesbian,
Mm.
gay, or they have another gender identity, persons who identify as transgender. So we really need to care for them. So we need to identify kung ano ba yung problems nila. So
Mm.
I think if I look at the SOGIE bill closely, the problems that they brought forth are yung inequality sa society, violent crimes against them, and discrimination against
Mm.
them. And yun yung kailangan i-address. And I think we both agree that there are discrimination. May mga crimes din talaga na nagagawa sa kanila. Inequality, yeah. I even brought a lot of statistics with me, di ba? Parang yung
Yes.
mga times na they were disproportionately disadvantaged. Yung mga kaibigan nating may same-sex attraction. I think yung psychological abuse on them is rampant. The HIV stats are disproportionately high sa mga persons who identify as gay. And
Mm.
aside from that, madami pa. So I think there really is a problem dun
Mm.
sa kanilang community that needs to
Yeah.
be addressed. And yun yung common ground. We agree that there really is a problem
Right.
in the community that needs to be addressed. So we agreed
Yeah.
there. Yeah.
Yeah. I think tama, no? I think that's important to establish talaga
Mm.
when we're talking to our friends who experience same-sex attraction, or kahit hindi, if there's
Mm.
someone who's pushing for SOGIE bill.
Mm.
I think it's important to establish at the start that we actually share a lot of the intentions, right? If the
Mm.
intention is to fight against unjust discrimination based on sex and gender, if our intention is to fight against abuse and violence and all these sorts of things, then parehas tayo doon, right?
Mm.
Magkakampi
Mm.
tayo dito. We also don't want that, right? That's the intention. Parehas
Yeah.
tayo ng intention. But I think what often is the difference is the methods,
Yes.
right? So
Yes.
the intention is this. We want to fight unjust discrimination. But how are we going to go about this? Ano yung mga gagawin nating actions to avoid this? And
Yes.
I like, one of the things that I like about your the dialogue, your side of the dialogue, is you kept on pointing to the costs. Ano yung costs nitong
Mm.
mga gusto nating gawin, mga ganyang bagay?
Mm.
Because I think sometimes pinagtatahi natin yung dalawa eh. We say na, okay, sige, SOGIE is for avoiding discrimination, fighting against discrimination. And then, pinagtatahin natin yung intentions at yung methods. Such that, when someone says na, hindi ako pro-SOGIE bill, ang usual na rebuttal is, so ano ka, like, okay lang sa'yo yung discrimination? But no, like,
Oo.
hindi, di ba?
Grabe.
Ano yung method? Yun ang pinag-uusapan
Yes,
natin.
yes.
Yun. So, siguro from there, sige, if that was the point of agreement, ano naman yung point of disagreement that you had with Michael?
What I used here is a strategy way of thinking ni Dr. Ryan T. Anderson, which I don't hear much sa mga SOGIE hearings dito sa Pilipinas. And according to Dr. Ryan T. Anderson, kinwestiyon ko dito is, masasolve ba ng SOGIE yung unjust discrimination, yung violence?
Is it effective?
Is it effective? And yung inequality. So, those are the three things that I brought up, di ba? Parang, we agree on these, pero masasolve ba siya ng SOGIE? And yung point of disagreement from my side is, I don't think masasolve ito ng SOGIE. And kung maririnig nyo sa dialogue yung, let's say, the violence part, and usually the violence happen sa isang transgender person, usually sa prostitution nangyayari ito eh. May isang foreigner nag-hire ng prostitute, tapos transgender tong prostitute, nagalit yung foreigner. And alam ko may case nito, and pinatay niya yung trans, sadly. Kaya importante yung sinabi ko kay Matt na, hey, I pwede ba akong mag-ask do sa other person? Because I did, I had an opportunity to ask the other person, parang, how would the SOGIE bill prevent that from happening, di ba? So, it made them think. I hope it made the listeners think kung paano nga ba mape-prevent ng SOGIE bill yung incident na yon from happening. Yeah. And it's a hard question to answer if you think about it. Parang kapag may SOGIE bill na, parang the only difference is instead of a crime, normal crime, is malilabel lang siyang hate crime, which is parang, what's the difference, di ba? Yun yung binring up ko. So that's one point of contention. Besides dun sa discrimination naman, most of the people na nagpo-push ng SOGIE bill ngayon, they have the mindset nung 23 years ago, nung unang binring up yung SOGIE bill. Actually, nung 23 years ago, medyo rampant ba talaga yung discrimination against LGBT? It may be true, it may not be true. Pero ngayon, it's a different era. And baliktad naman ang nangyayari ngayon. There's good evidence that persons who identify as LGBT are not locked out of the job market or sa politics for identifying as LGBT. In fact, the opposite can be seen. And dun sa dialogue, I brought up na parang because of ESG, environmental social governance, mas naghanap pa nga ng mga members of the LGBT community yung most of the companies. So, yun yung binigay ko. And I wish I expounded on the difference between equality of opportunity versus equality of outcome. Kasi minsan niisip ng mga tao, parang kailangan laging may, parang yung sa mga pelikula na kailangan well-represented ang bawat race, bawat sexual orientation, and they think yung isang company should work that way then. So, yan, I hope I answered the question.
Yeah. Thank you for that.
Yun. Okay.
One of the things that I remember din na binabalik-balikan ni Michael Pastor is the part where he talks about how we need to take a look at the specific cultural context of the Philippines. Diba?
Tama ka.
Isa yun sa mga
and that's a good point, actually.
Banggaan nyo, diba? Kasi you're referring to what you're saying is,
Oo.
na we can learn from our Western counterparts na
Mm.
yung mga ginagawa na nila, pwedeng hindi rin natin gawin. While
Mm.
on the other hand, siya naman is pointing out na, oo, pero at the same
That's a
time,
good point.
there is may specific tayong kultura. And he
Mm.
talked about language, he talked about yung pakikitungo natin sa isa't isa, and so on and
Mm.
so forth. What terms mean, translatable ba lahat yun? How we gather data, and so on.
Mm.
Anong sa tingin mo doon? Like, would you like to expound more on that? Doon sa specific na contention na yun? Kasi isa yun sa mga napansin kong
Oo.
talagang na-bring up again and again during your dialogue.
Tama ka. And that's a good point that he brought up. Ang gusto ko lang naman sabihin is, at least let's put this into the equation na this already happened in other countries. Why are we not talking about this as much sa Congress and sa Senate? In hindsight na nila, di ba? Tayo, parang foresight pa lang iniisip natin. So, I did always bring that up because that's a relevant data. Usually, pag gumagawa tayo ng batas dito sa Pilipinas, we think as though na parang yung data i-gather pa lang natin. Pero may mga available data na tayo sa ibang bansa. May it be divorce, the SOGIE Bill. Siguro in the future kung yung abortion pag-usapan, there's relevant data na sa ibang bansa. And I just hope na we consider them. And that's a valid point na iba yung kultura dito sa Pilipinas. We may or may not go down that route. Medyo may pagka parang circular din nga yung argument ni Mike there. He was using the cultural difference angle. But in the end, maridinig natin na nung sinabi ko na this will be culture defining. Parang sinabi niya na, hey, we need to change the culture or the culture nagbabago yan. So medyo may pagka-circular din, di ba? Parang
Yes. One of the things also that I noticed as a listener, kasi the title of the episode is it's a discussion on SOGIE Bill,
mm-mm.
right? But when I was listening already to the episode, it seems like, ano ko lang to,
Sige,
this is
go
my
ahead.
perspective.
Go ahead.
It seems like parang nagbabago-bago yung subject every now and then,
Mm-mm.
right? Are we talking about the bill itself, or are we talking about gender ideology? Parang may mga times na we're talking about, yun nga, the ano ba yung effects ng bill? Is it necessary? Is it
Yes.
needed? So on and so forth, ganyan. Well, on the other hand, parang maya-maya, nag-shift bigla, nagiging, ang topic na is gender ideology. Stuff na wala pa sa bill, sabihin natin, ano ba mga example ng nabanggit na wala pa sa bill? Like yung
Puberty blockers.
puberty blockers, gender
Oo.
transitioning, wala pa yun sa bill. But
Wala
napag-uusapan na rin
pa.
siya in this dialogue. And that's also how Michael opened the conversation, 'di ba? Sa umpisa,
Tama.
binigyan kayo ng time to introduce. What he mentioned is not about the bill, but about SOGIE. I mean, about gender ideology.
Yes.
Ganyan. No, what do you think about that sentiment?
And I think kasalanan ko yun. I'm the one who always bring up the gender ideology part din naman. And I agree, tama yung observation mo. Aminin ko, yung weakness ko kasi is I'm not a lawyer. I cannot talk about yung mga nitty-gritty ng legalities sa SOGIE Bill or if there are other yung mga batas na maaring mag-contradict dito or matamaan ng SOGIE. So I leave that to lawyers. Although I listened to debates ng friend ng podcast, si Attorney Joel Arzaga, who is a lawyer. So I took some notes from him when he debates the SOGIE Bill. Pero ako, the thing is, I did this intentionally na isingit yung gender ideology sa discussion. And one reason is I did this as a strategy. Because right now, any sane Pinoy would oppose gender ideology. And if you explain to them that this is what's happening in the world today. Biological men competing in women's sports, men entering women's spaces, yung mga prisoners na mga lalaki na nag-identify na babae, tapos napunta sila sa prison ng babae and they impregnated yung mga women doon. I think makakita ka ng malaking agreement with the Filipinos na mali yun. Sa ibang bansa, baka medyo mag 50-50 pa. Pero here in our country, I would like to think na sane pa tayong mga Pinoy. And number 2, I said na this is a strategy, but I'm not being deceptive. Because the truth is, gender ideology is embedded in the SOGIE Bill. If you read nga, yung nabanggit ko kanina, if you read the SOGIE Bill, all the gender ideology buzzwords are there. So, may mga parang glossary siya eh. Kung yung mga terms, what do these terms mean? So, makikita mo gender identity, gender expression, etc., etc. And these are mostly gender ideology buzzwords. So, nandun nga sa pangalan ng SOGIE Bill, di ba? Parang may gender identity and expression. And in fact, medyo dun ako nag-zero in eh. Hindi ako masyadong nag-zero in sa sexual orientation part. So, dun ako nag-zero in sa gender identity and expression. And that's because, yun nga, that was my strategy during that time. And what I'm telling the audience is the bottom of the slippery slope. In the US, they nandun na sila sa transitioning of minors. I've been talking about this sa podcast that it started with social transitioning. Nag-change sila ng pronouns. And yung pag-change ng pronouns, medyo nag-creep in na dito sa Pilipinas eh. So it started with their equality bills. Nag-start yan because nag-push ng mga equality bills yung mga activists na they supported the LGBT movement. And hindi man federal level, but on the state level, nag-start yan. Then, mahal yung puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones sa pag-transition. What happened is they pushed for equality in healthcare. Tapos iisipin mo, parang, teka, dinideny ba ang mga transgender ng opportunity na matreat ng isang doktor compared sa mga non-trans counterparts nila? The truth is hindi. Pero what they actually mean by equality in healthcare is yung pagta-transition, they want insurance companies to cover it. So sagutin niyo yung pag-transition namin. So that's what the Equality Act or the equality bills in the US or any other parts of the world has led to. So yun yung gusto kong ibigay na message.
Right.
Kaya I linked the SOGIE Bill to gender ideology. Una, I was meaning to use it as a strategy, but it's really not far off sa reality. So,
okay. That's an interesting perspective. Right. So, kumbaga, these things that you've mentioned, correct me if I'm wrong, if I'm understanding you correctly.
Yeah.
These things that you've mentioned, they're not found in the bill yet.
Yeah.
Alam mo yun? It's not found in the law na ngayon nilalaban whether to pass or not. However, am I correct in understanding na what you're saying is that even if it's not found there, this bill could pave the way for that.
Yes.
Parang ganun
Yes.
na. If na-open tong pintong to, baka bumuhos lahat yan. Lahat ng mga bagay na nangyayari ngayon sa states.
So it will set the precedent for those things to happen. So it will be the groundwork for these things to happen, and which already did happen sa ibang bansa. So we may be different culturally, but who knows? This is an ideological colonization nga, sabi ni Pope Francis.
Yes. Perhaps, syempre, this is conjecture. Perhaps, that's where he's coming from din. Na hindi ba pinapangunahan natin? Like, SOGIE Bill pa lang, and then we're expecting already that these things would happen. He mentioned something
That's a valid point then.
which is
That's a valid point.
possible din naman, di ba? I
Mm.
actually, when I was listening to the conversation, I was also surprised by how much I agreed with Michael. As in, there were a lot of premises na I agreed with him. Pero perhaps I didn't agree so much with some of the conclusions. Like, for example, he mentioned that there is a gender data gap. Diba? Dahil nga, yun nga, when it comes to like translating, paano mo nga naman ita-translate yung like transgender, yung difference in transgender sa gay, translate it into like the Filipino, we only have one word for it. Isa yun sa mga in-explain niya na parang napaisip ako, oo nga, no? Like, medyo, dahil nga it's not part of our culture, it's not directly translatable, and so some of the data might not be as well represented. So, in certain respects, I agree with what he was saying. There's a difference in culture. It's important to recognize. It's important for us to gather data of our own while we're looking at data from abroad. Siguro, like, ang sa akin, if we're acknowledging that there's a need for more data, then baka okay na hindi muna tayo mag-pass ng law. Diba? Kasi nga, kailangan pa natin ng data eh. Diba?
Actually, yun yung medyo chicken and egg dun sa pag-gather ng data. And in hindsight, alam ko nag-pushback ako dun sa sa parang should we have data on, let's say, crime, on gaano karami yung nangyayaring crime sa LGBT, because meron lang tayo crime statistics ng female and male, pero wala yung LGBT. I remember parang nag-pushback ako doon. In hindsight, parang I'm thinking, should have dapat ba nag-pushback ako, or it's something that I think I can agree with. Wala namang masama doon. So instinctively, nag-pushback lang ako. But ang point ko lang doon for pushing back is baka kapag in-apply na natin yung distinctions doon sa ibang bansa, ilinalagay na nila sa category ng woman yung trans woman. So it might poison the data, the well, or baka maging unreliable na. Especially sa medical field wherein important yung difference ng man and woman when it comes to administering medicine. Dahil ang daming biological difference talaga ng lalaki sa babae. Yung sa hearing lang, di ba? Mas
yung
malakas makadinig yung...
Jason.
Oo, mas malakas yung hearing ng babae kaysa sa lalaki. And marami pang iba. Yun lang yung reason kung bakit nag-pushback ako. I think there can be some middle ground there when it comes sa crime. So in hindsight, that's one of the things that I could have expounded more, and maybe pwede akong makahanap ng middle ground on that one.
Right. Okay. Sige. Building up on that, right? I wanna this time talk about another common ground na I was surprised that happened. Nasa dulo na to ng conversation eh. I was surprised this was brought up, diba? Nung nanghihingi na ng recommendations si Matt. You said that you only have one recommendation, which is What is a Woman, the documentary by Matt Walsh. Ganyan. And then you asked Michael, how would you answer that question? What is a woman? And his response was, sabi niya, like he's referring to a biological basis, diba? That a woman is an adult female. That's what he said. And
which is the right answer.
Which is the right answer, but it was surprising kasi just previously, parang yung previous part bago nag-recommendations, he was talking about specifically the trans, diba? Yung bakit parang merong disparity between those who identify as gay and those who identify as trans, bakit parang hindi sila nagkakasundo. We see this on Twitter and so on. He talked about that. So he does acknowledge like yung concept ng trans and so on. And yet he said na ang definition niya of a woman is like an adult female. And what are your thoughts on that answer?
Oo nga, it may or may not be a gotcha na put on record ka for saying that. So, yung biological basis for it, and di ko alam if he might get in trouble with his base for saying that. What I could have done is, if may time sana, I could have pushed further by asking, so you mean trans women are not women? So yun yung, yung follow-up dyan, di ba?
Mm.
Kasi he might mean female, pero iba pala yung meaning ng female na sa kanya. I remember this
Napush lang.
time, I remember this time na may guest si Tim Pool. Si Lance from Surf TV yung guest niya. Sabi ni Lance, a woman is an adult human female. So yun yung tamang response. Pero nung pinrest ni Tim Pool, si Lance, sabi niya, tinanong niya yung sinabi kong question. So trans women are not women? So hindi naman makasagot si Lance. That is because binago niya yung definition ng female to include trans women. So kung may time pa sana, I could have pressed further kung what do you mean by female, trans or trans women, not women. So
Right, yeah. Yeah. Well, that's a part na, well, for now, we don't know, di
we
ba?
don't know.
Siguro kung
Yeah.
magkaroon ng opportunity in the future, makapag-usap ulit, that could be something that is brought up, di ba? For all we know, baka meron din siyang like cohesive concept of the idea, and that's why he was able to answer that
Yes.
way.
Yes.
Yun.
Yes.
Ako personally, I like the way Trent Horn answers the question. Yung a human being naturally ordered toward gestation.
Mas precise
Parang,
yun.
kasi, it's very precise, di ba?
Oo.
Kasi it's about gestation, able to bear kids through pregnancy and so on. So talagang ginone in niya na kung ano yung meaning niya of the word female. Yun.
And I would recommend din yung mga taong nakikinig. If you're asked what is a man, what is a woman, human being ordered towards insemination pag lalaki and gestation kapag babae. Hindi lang magandang pakinggan yung ganun eh. Hindi siya pang t-shirt.
Kasi kailangan mo pa i-define.
Kailangan pa i-define. Kaya sumikat yung kay Matt Walsh na an adult human female.
Yes.
So,
right.
but basically, if you stick to the strict meaning of female, yun na rin yung ibig niya sabihin. Parang a female of the species was ordered towards gestation.
Right. Sige. So maybe as we draw this debrief also to one end, no? Ngayong tapos na siya, ngayong like na-publish na siya and so on, the conversation, how do you feel about it? How do you feel about the exchange? Were you satisfied with how it turned out? Are there things that you would have preferred to go differently? Or as in, okay na ba yun? How do you feel about the conversation?
Oh yeah, 2 hours lang yung conversation. Actually, mahaba na nga yung 2 hours, but it's not enough to discuss this topic. Like we said, there are things that pwede pa naming ma-expound on. But I'm grateful for this conversation. I'm happy na I was invited by Matt Ordonez, and I'm happy to have met Michael Pastor, who is very, very cordial, respectful sa buong conversation. And I'm happy that it happened and it got released. Kasi kinakabahan ako nung una that the dialogue might not see the light of day. Dahil sa totoo lang, with how Facebook, YouTube, and other social media, how they moderate their contents, mas in danger pa nga yung podcast niya to have invited me and my viewpoints than the pro-SOGIE guy, di ba? I thought medyo hindi niya i-release. Because I have been in many interviews where the interview was not released. Di ko alam kung baka lousy lang ako interviewin or because of the content. I'm glad they released this on the last day ng Pride Month. So June 30 nila release. Actually, nag-over-prepare nga ako dun sa conversation. I prepared in case na tanungin lang yung babaylan question, or if they ask the suicide question, if they brought up the suicide issue, or if they brought up the intersex issue. So I prepared for that. Hindi lang namin napag-usapan yung mga yan because I think kulang yung 2 hours. I received some feedback that sabi na I should have quote-unquote destroyed my opponent. So yung gusto na yung kailangan pinahiya ko daw siya pero medyo hindi. I tried to make it as charitable as I can because yun din yung gusto nating ituro sa mga listeners.
Oo,
Tama ka?
sobrang galing nga eh na that this happened at all eh. I think we need more of this,
Mm.
'di ba? Kasi nakakasawa rin yung mga nakikita natin online na like nagpo-post lang one after the other. Alam mo yun, syempre
Oh, yeah.
kung ano ka, may mga toxic na progressives pero may mga toxic na
Mm.
conservatives din.
True.
Tapos yan, nag-aaway
True.
lang sa isa't
Mm.
isa at
Mm.
walang actual na dialogue na nangyayari, which is important kasi sometimes
Mm.
that's how you form better ideas eh. 'Di ba? When you talk to one
Mm.
another, especially someone that you don't agree with. Pero ang prerequisite nun is kailangan parehas kayong respectful. Parehas kayo kaya I like that you also mentioned that si Michael was very cordial, that
Mm.
he was very as in he was very also what do you call this? I'm looking for the word. I'm looking for the word na hindi ko right,
Babalik
articulate
ka na.
'yon.
Yeah,
I
yeah, yeah,
was not
yeah.
articulate right there. Pero ayun, he was very articulate with his ideas, which is okay, 'di ba? We need more
Mm.
conversations like this para kasi I'm sure tayo din eh, may mga
Mm.
natututunan din tayo from them and
Oh,
we
yeah,
hope
yeah,
na sana may natutunan
yeah.
din sila from us, from you specifically since you were the one
Hopefully,
who
yeah, hopefully.
did the conversation. And closing in on that as a final question. Para natin pwedeng mas gawin pa 'yon. So one thing is what you did,
Mm.
'di ba? You were invited to have this public discussion with someone. But a lot of us, we're talking to our friends, we're talking to our office mates, we're talking to our acquaintances, family members, ganyan. As Filipino Catholics, as faithful Filipino Catholics, what can we do? What can we do in order to better dialogue with our neighbor who identify as LGBT or who are pushing for laws like the SOGIE Bill to be passed? How can we better dialogue with them?
Yeah, I'll take a page from our friends Jason Everett, yung sinabi niya sa atin, the first thing you do is listen muna, di ba? Parang we listen to them, yung mga brothers and sisters natin who identify as LGBT, they might have a reason kung bakit napunta sila doon, they feel this, they identify as this. So, let's listen muna, di ba? Hindi maiwasan yung lalo na sa we have advocacies, I have an advocacy, hindi maiwasan na may mga magtatampo. I had a talk recently and may isang audience doon, alay siya. And I tried to be as charitable as I can doon sa talk. And ilang beses kong sinabi na, guys, we need to be charitable, we need to talk to them with love in our hearts. Pero hindi na iwasan, may na-offend pa rin naalay. I have a close family member. Alam niya na this is my stance. Pero na-offend pa rin siya. So, hindi maiiwasan talaga. So, I think the best thing you could do, ito yung tip ni Father Franz Dison sa atin na kailangan kausapin mo lang sila like how you talk to other people in your family, other friends, na parang bang they're not different. Yun yung way to talk to them. And then when the dialogue comes, be prepared. I made an episode last time on the 3 pillars. We need to prepare, study, then apply. So yung preparation part is, yun yung art There's art in dialogue. And I think balikan yun lang yung episode na yun. Not to self-promote, pero may mga tips ako na binigay doon that would help you prepare. Number 2 is study the issues. Just in case na biglang may pumasok na conversation, be prepared. Study the issues. At least may masasagot ka. And lastly, yung apply. Yun yung pinakamahirap na part. And kung nahihirapan kang i-apply yung mga natutunan mo or napag-aralan mo. Just live your life as a Catholic, as a Christian, on how Christ would want you to live your life. Kasi you can evangelize through your life kung if you're doing what the gospel tells you to do, it will show di ba? Without speaking, biglang sila na yung magtatanong parang, bakit ang blooming mo tignan parate? And then that's the time you evangelize. You tell them about Christ. Kasi prayer helps. And yung regular na pagsisimba, it helps. So that's the time you evangelize. I think just yung lagi ko sinasabi, yung favorite line ko ni Patrick Coffin, be a saint. What else is there? So just do that kung nahiya kang mag-evangelize. And then it will come naturally. To cap it all up, listen, be a saint, be prepared sa issues. Minsan may specialization. Depende kung anong problema nung kaibigan mo. I have a friend na medyo rocky yung relationship niya sa asawa. So, you know that you need to prepare on topics like divorce, separation, so remarriage. So, mapapansin mo kung ano yung kailangan mo. Yung SOGIE is a broad topic. Merong part doon na sexual orientation. Meron ding part doon na gender identity and expression. It depends kung are your friends more on the sexual orientation part or the gender identity part. So siguro mag-zero in ka by studying those. Narrow down mo yung kailangan mo i-study. So yan, Mon, thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Ang ganda nung sinabi mo, lalo yung part about treating them as friends, treating them as family members. Basically, treating them as people because they are people, diba? They're not projects to be solved. They're people. They have a story. They have more to them than their stances. In the same way that there is more to us than our stances. Talagang yung person-to-person relationship is very important. So, yun. Thank you, Jay, as in. Galing.
Hey, Mon, thanks for doing this with me. And we're at the end of the episode. So, to those interested to listen to the dialogue that we just discussed here, check out PI Podcast in their Spotify channel or Apple or whatever podcast channel they might be on. Mon, anything you'd like to promote before we wrap this up?
Yes, yun. Like I mentioned, I am part of FEAST Bellevue PM, so you could check me out there. Salit-salit na kami ni Brother Mike Vinas, if you know him. I have 2 podcasts now. I have Not So Secular, which is my personal podcast. And I have the Bible Nerds podcast, which is a podcast that is connected with the Feast also. And there, para yung inside edition of the regular talks that we give on the Sunday feast. So if you want a further exploration of what we talk about every Sunday during the feast, that is one way that you could get into that. So that's Not So Secular podcast, my own, and the Bible Nerds podcast, which I am part of a panel. Ayan.
Ay, galing. Okay, Mon, God bless you. Thanks for being here with me tonight. This has been another episode of the JAY ARUGA Show. At the end of the day, it will be night. Goodbye. If this episode made your day, or even if it didn't, please press that follow button right there. If you're listening in Apple Podcast, please give us a 5-star review. Spread the word, tell your friends, family, your dog to subscribe as well. Thank you very much.